The Mediterranean in the spring of 1941 was a theater of desperate improvisation and chilling strategic necessity. To the north, the German war machine had already devoured the Balkans, leaving the British Empire clinging to a singular, rugged outpost in the Aegean. This was the island of Crete, a jagged spine of rock that stood as the final sentry guarding the approaches to the Suez Canal and the oil fields of the Middle East. For Winston Churchill, Crete was an unsinkable aircraft carrier, a base from which to strike the Romanian oil fields at Ploiesti. For Adolf Hitler, it was a festering thorn in the side of his southern flank, an obstacle that had to be neutralized before his true obsession, the invasion of the Soviet Union, could begin. The man tasked with removing this thorn was General Kurt Student, the visionary architect of Germany's airborne forces. Student was a man obsessed with the vertical flank, believing that the parachute and the glider had rendered traditional trench warfare and coastal defenses obsolete. He proposed a plan of unprecedented audacity, Operation Mercury. It would be the first time in history that an island would be taken entirely from the air, without the initial support of heavy naval or ground forces. It was a gamble that relied on speed, surprise, and the perceived invincibility of the Fallschirmjäger, the elite Green Devils who had shocked the world at Airborne. Yet, beneath the veneer of German efficiency, a series of systemic failures was already beginning to erode the foundation of the operation. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence, suffered from a catastrophic lack of accurate data. They estimated the Allied strength on Crete at no more than 5,000 demoralized survivors from the Greek mainland. In reality, General Bernard Freyberg, the New Zealand WWII winner in command of the island, oversaw a force of over 40,000 British, Commonwealth, and Greek troops. This intelligence gap was not merely a clerical error, it was a fundamental misreading of the enemy's will and numbers that would lead the German paratroopers into a meat grinder. The irony of the situation was sharpened by the fact that the Allies possessed the ultimate advantage, ultra. Through the breaking of the Enigma code, Churchill and Freyberg knew almost every detail of the German plan, from the landing zones to the exact hour of the invasion. However, Freyberg faced a paralyzing dilemma. He could not position his troops too overtly without revealing to the Germans that their codes had been compromised. This led to a strange, shadowboxing defense where the defenders were prepared for an airborne assault, yet were still hamstrung by the need to protect against a seaborne invasion that the Germans were barely capable of launching. On the morning of May 20, 1941, the skies over Crete filled with the low, rhythmic hum of thousands of Junkers Ju-52 transport planes. To the soldiers on the ground, the sight was both terrifying and magnificent. Hundreds of multicolored parachutes blossomed against the Mediterranean blue, carrying the first wave of the 7th Flieger Division. But as the paratroopers drifted toward the olive groves and vineyards, the silence of the morning was shattered by a cacophony of small arms fire. The Germans were not dropping onto a confused and retreating enemy, they were falling directly into a pre-registered kill zone. The tactical disaster began the moment the first man exited the aircraft. The German paratroopers of 1941 utilized a parachute design that forced the soldier to jump with only a pistol and a combat knife. Their primary weapons, rifles, submachine guns, and light machine guns, were dropped in separate canisters marked with colored bands. This meant that upon landing, the elite Fallschirmjäger were effectively defenseless until they could crawl through open ground to find their equipment. The New Zealand and Australian troops, positioned on the heights overlooking the landing zones at Maleme, Kenya, and Rethymno, did not give them that chance. In the first hours of the assault, the casualties were staggering. Entire companies were wiped out before they even touched the ground. The 3 Battalion of the 1st Assault Regiment, landing near the village of Maleme, suffered a casualty rate of nearly 75% in the first 30 minutes. Men were found tangled in the branches of olive trees, riddled with bullets, or lying in the rocky soil, unable to reach the canisters that held their means of survival. The German plan was fracturing under the weight of its own assumptions, and Kurt Student, sitting in his command post in Athens, was receiving nothing but reports of silence or catastrophe. The struggle for the Maleme airfield became the pivot point upon which the entire campaign would turn. Maleme was a dusty strip of land bordered by the Tavronitis River and dominated by a feature known as Hill 107. If the Germans could capture this hill, they could control the airfield and begin landing the heavy reinforcements they so desperately needed. the defence of Hill 107 was entrusted to the 22nd New Zealand Battalion, a unit of battle-hardened soldiers. For the first day, they held firm, repelling wave after wave of desperate German attacks. The slopes of the hill became a charnel house, littered with the bodies of the Green Devils who had tried to scale its heights. But here, a systemic failure of communication and leadership occurred on the Allied side. Lieutenant Colonel Leslie Andrew, the commander of the 22nd Battalion, found himself isolated. His radios were failing, and he was under the mistaken impression that his flanks were collapsing. Despite the fact that his men were successfully holding the summit, Andrew made the fateful decision to withdraw under the cover of darkness. He believed he was saving his men for a better defensive position, but in reality, he was handing the Germans the only key that could unlock the island. When the sun rose on the second day, the Germans were stunned to find the summit of Hill 107 abandoned. With the height secured, they could now bring the airfield under direct fire control. Even though the runway was still being raked by Allied artillery, the German pilots began a series of suicidal landings. Ju-52s roared in, crashing into one another, landing on top of wrecks, and grinding to halts in the dirt. Every plane that landed brought more mountain troops, more ammunition, and more hope for the German cause. The logistical nightmare of the first day was being overcome by sheer, brutal attrition and the exploitation of a single tactical error. While the battle raged on the land, the waters around Crete became a graveyard for the Royal Navy. Admiral Andrew Cunningham, the commander of the Mediterranean Fleet, was determined to prevent any German seaborne reinforcements from reaching the island. He succeeded in intercepting the German crasher flotillas, small, requisitioned Greek carracks filled with German soldiers, but the price was astronomical. Without air cover, the British cruisers and destroyers were sitting ducks for the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers. The sight of the great ships of the Royal Navy, including the HMS Gloucester and HMS Fiji, being torn apart by aerial bombardment was a grim herald of the new era of naval warfare. Cunningham famously remarked that it took 3 years to build a ship but 300 years to build a tradition, and he was willing to sacrifice the fleet to save the army. But as the losses mounted, the reality became clear: the Royal Navy could not operate in the face of total German air superiority. The sea, which had always been Britain's shield, had been turned into a trap. The tragedy of Crete was not limited to the uniformed soldiers. One of the most shocking elements for the German invaders was the fierce, often primitive resistance of the Cretan civilians. Men, women, and even children rose up against the paratroopers with whatever they had at hand: ancient hunting rifles, kitchen knives, and farm implements. To the Fallschirmjäger, who expected the locals to remain neutral or even welcoming, this was an outrage. The German reaction was swift and brutal, marking the beginning of a cycle of reprisal and resistance that would characterize the occupation for years to realization. The massacre at Condamari, where German paratroopers executed male villagers in cold blood, was a dark stain on the honor of the elite unit. It was a manifestation of the frustration and fear felt by soldiers who had been promised a swift victory and instead found themselves in a nightmare of partisan warfare. The Cretans were the unsung heroes of the battle, delaying German movements and providing intelligence to the Allies at the cost of their villages and their lives. Their defiance turned the island into a cauldron of hatred that the Germans could never truly extinguish. By the 5th day, the strategic situation for the Allies had become untenable. Despite their superior numbers and the initial success of their defense, the loss of Maleme had allowed a steady stream of German reinforcements to pour onto the island. The Allied troops, exhausted, short on water, and under constant aerial bombardment, began a grueling retreat across the White Mountains toward the southern port of Sfakia. This was a march of misery, where men collapsed from heat exhaustion and thirst, and the wounded were often left behind to face the mercy of the advancing Germans. The evacuation at Sfakia was a miniature Dunkirk, but with a far more tragic ending. While thousands were successfully taken off by the Royal Navy under the cover of night, nearly 5,000 British and Commonwealth troops were left on the beaches as the final ships departed. They were forced to surrender, their war over in the shadow of the cliffs. The Battle of Crete ended not with a grand strategic victory, but with a weary, blood-soaked realization that the landscape of war had changed forever. When the final tallies were calculated, the victory for Germany was so costly that it felt like a defeat. the Fallschirmjäger had suffered nearly 7,000 casualties, a number so high that Hitler was horrified. He famously told Kurt student that the day of the parachute was over, believing that the element of surprise had been lost forever. The Green Devils would never again be used in a major airborne operation. For the rest of the war, they would fight as elite infantry, their wings clipped by the very island they had fought so hard to conquer. The historical irony of Crete lies in its aftermath. The Germans had won the island but lost their most potent tactical weapon. The Allies had lost the island but gained a blueprint for their own future airborne successes. The lessons learned in the blood of Maleme and Rethymno would be studied by Allied planners to ensure that when they returned to the continent, their own paratroopers would not fall into the same traps. Crete was the grave of the German paratrooper, but it was also the cradle of the Allied airborne divisions that would one day drop over Normandy. The philosophical takeaway of this conflict is found in the fragility of planning and the chaotic nature of human error. A single decision to withdraw from a hill, a single failure to communicate, and a single intelligence oversight can nullify the bravery of thousands. Crete was a battle of what ifs a moment where the course of the war in the Mediterranean could have been altered by a few more hours of resolve or a few more functioning radios. It remains a testament to the fact that in war, the most sophisticated machines and the most elite soldiers are ultimately subservient to the geography of the land and the unpredictability of the human spirit. As the sun sets over the rugged peaks of the White Mountains today, the silence is a far cry from the roar of the Junkers and the scream of the Stukas. The olive trees still grow in the valleys where the Green Devils fell, their roots nourished by the blood of men from half a world away. The ruins of the bunkers and the rusting hulks of the gliders have long since been reclaimed by the earth, leaving only the cemeteries as a reminder of the cost of Operation Mercury. It was a victory of the air, a tragedy of the sea, and a timeless lesson in the high price of audacity. In the end, Crete was more than just a strategic waypoint, it was a crucible that burned away the last remnants of old-world military thinking. It proved that the sky was no longer a canopy, but a battlefield. It showed that the will of a civilian population could be as formidable as any army. And it left behind a legacy of heroism and horror that still echoes through the canyons of the Aegean, a haunting melody of a battle that everyone won and everyone lost. The ghosts of the Fallschirmjäger and the Anzacs remain part of the island's DNA, a permanent fixture in the landscape of memory. Their sacrifice serves as a grim reminder that even the most daring military maneuvers are ultimately written in the ledger of human life. The story of Crete is not one of triumph, but of the relentless, grinding machinery of war, and the individuals who were caught between the cogs of history. As the tide pulls away from the beaches of Sfakia, it carries with it the echoes of a conflict that redefined the limits of human endurance and the terrifying potential of the modern age.